Hello, everybody. So next up, we've got Matt Shull with his talk, A Tale of Creativity, ES2015, and Using Native Components in Production. So I'll get out of your way, Matt, and over.
Thanks. Awesome. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Shull, and I'm the Director of Labs at Aristotle Labs in Little Rock, Arkansas. And over the last several months, my team and I have been working with using ES2015 and also web components as well. Let me go to the next slide here. Slight lag here. There we go. So my team and I, we've been working on working with vanilla web components, and at Aristotle Labs, we have a couple of software as a service products that we are building, and those software as a service products are geared around the Internet of Things. And so we have our flagship product is called Beacon Sage, and Beacon Sage allows you to, it's using the physical web, which is out of Google, and it gives you the ability to attach a web page to a physical object. A spin-off of that was a product called Proxbox, which is geared specifically towards real estate agents. And when we started to build Proxbox, we started to notice that there were common elements in our products. Things like cards that we would show information on that people could flip over and show other information on the back, or forms, or the way that we presented videos and everything, and photo galleries. We noticed that there were these common elements in all of our products and our projects, and we also noticed that we were repeating code. We knew that we wanted to not repeat ourselves and kind of keep everything compact. And also we wanted to have a style guide. Our vision was to have a place where designers and developers could have a common language and kind of a common place where they could see how to use these kind of compact modules that they could then go and prototype things a lot faster, or they could develop things quicker. And then with that, we wanted to have a browser support of IE11 and on into Edge, and then of course all the major browsers and mobile browsers as well. But we wanted to do it with as few libraries or as few frameworks as possible. We really wanted to try to use the platform because we had noticed that the platform has evolved and has matured over the years. And so we started to set out on a journey, and this was several months ago, and we started to try to find ways to encapsulate all of that code into reusable components. And so we first looked into CSS modules. We weren't really, it didn't feel right to us. It didn't feel like a standard necessarily using CSS modules. We looked at frameworks. We tried Angular 2 with the Angular components that came from there, and it was a lot better, but it still didn't feel kind of like the spec, kind of like what was given to us. We looked at React components as well, and we're very happy with the flexibility and how fast they were. But again, it just still didn't feel quite right. And then we looked at Vue.js components and the Vue.js framework, and we really liked the framework in terms of its routing, and even like just the syntax seemed to be more of a fit for our team, and using kind of a standard, the platform that the web gives us. But we ended up using Vue.js for our router, but not for components. And then we came across web components, and we had heard a lot of talk about web components. Of course, the specs were being fleshed out, and we heard a lot about Polymer. So we started digging into what web components were, and we immediately fell in love with that idea that you're using the basic building blocks of the web to basically create Legos that you then put together. And our team was like, this is exactly what we needed, exactly kind of the starry-eyed dreamer idea of what the solution for our problem would be. So we started looking into web components and decided to give it a shot. So we took a look at a few different ways. The first was Xtag. We didn't look much into Xtag because we realized that it wasn't as big of a community at the time, and we did very light research there. So the one that really stuck out to us was Polymer. We really enjoyed Polymer. We enjoyed the way that the elements were created using another element. We really love just this the kind of sugar on top that Polymer provides to you and the binding, and so we were happy with Polymer. But again, we went back to that idea of, well, is there a way that we could get even closer to the platform? That was kind of our challenge internally, was could we use vanilla JavaScript? And it turns out that we could use vanilla JavaScript. And so we were using ES2015 and using Babel to transpile code. And so we were like, okay, well, with classes and everything kind of coming out, would we be able to use that? So we started looking into what that took. And whenever we decided to use vanilla JavaScript, we kind of, right as soon as we did that, the V1 specs for custom elements and Shadow DOM had just come out. So we were like, okay, well, should we go with the V0 spec, which a lot of people seem to be using right now, or do we just keep going forward with the V1 spec and stay ahead of that curve? And so we started to look at the polyfills, and it turns out there were polyfills available for the V1 spec. And shout out to Eric Battleman and Rob Dotson for helping us kind of find those. And so we decided, you know what, let's go with the V1 spec. And so we started using the custom element method and using slot instead of content. And then, of course, the lifecycle callbacks were named a little bit differently, and functions were a little bit different than V0. But we found the polyfills. We decided to give it a shot. And there were a few things in the polyfills, a few gotchas that weren't huge, but were things that really jumped out at us once we started building some web components. The first polyfill that we noticed was shady CSS. One of the biggest things that we noticed was having to use a selector before the slotted selector. So you'll see here in our code for CSS, we've got an ID of errors header before the slotted selector that has an H1 attached to it. So you have to make sure that there is that selector to the left of it so that it recognizes, so the polyfill will work. Wasn't too bad of a fix. I mean, we just wrapped everything inside of an element and gave it the ID of our element's name, camel cased. And that's just kind of the way we decided to handle that. So that wasn't too bad. We did notice as well that there were some dynamic CSS changes. You had to call update styles in order to make those dynamic CSS changes. And so again, nothing crazy, but something to definitely look out for. And then with the custom elements polyfill, we noticed that adopted callback was something that was not supported. So we've not necessarily had a situation where we needed to use it yet, but it is good knowledge to have. Then also we saw on the repo in the documentation, it talks about ES5 versus ES2015, and if you are using ES2015 and transpiling your code, you'll need to use a native shim JavaScript file as well, so that these polyfills will work. And all of these things and more are documented on the Web Components GitHub repo, and so you can see a kind of a full list of things there to kind of look out for. Since you are using a polyfill and it's not the spec of the browser, there just are some limitations there, but it's nothing that deterred us from continuing forward. So we decided, okay, let's give it a shot and let's create a couple of components for this Proxbox project that we're doing. So now I'm going to switch over to the fun stuff and talk about, first I'm going to show you kind of the Proxbox admin and show you a couple of the elements that we're using. Then we're going to look at the code for those elements, and then we'll look at something else that came out of using that. So if we switch over here. So here we have our Proxbox admin that we're using, and I'm going to log in real quick one more time. So here you can see that we have in our code these select drop downs are actually a custom element. This custom element is very similar to a select element. It's got some styles baked in, but it does have some behaviors baked in. So you see we've got our options inside of that element, and then it works just like any select would. But these are very kind of specific to our needs, the select boxes, because when I change the select box, it will remove, it looks at all the ERIS selects and removes that beacon from that other property that it was attached to and attaches it here. So this is not how a normal select necessarily would work, but because there's always going to be that beacon's only going to be attached to one thing on the page, we went ahead and made the select do that. Then also, if we were to go into another part, so we have our select box that we created, and then we created a toast as well. So if I go in and I edit one of these, I can save it, and in the bottom left of the screen here, you'll see it says beacon edited, and it's using this ERIS toast element, which has our message to the user inside there, so that it, whenever we use the the peak method, it will actually kind of show that toast for a little bit and then hide it away. We also have a show method as well that will just permanently put it up there, and then a hide method which will take whatever is permanently put up there and bring it down. So it's kind of a web component for toast messages to our users. So those are the two elements that we had created for this project. And now we're going to look at the code for, there we go, bring this up, for the project. So you can see that we have a components folder over here in our project. Oops. Bring that back. We have a components folder over here. We decided at first that we were just going to have a components folder and have a JavaScript file for each of the components, have our HTML and our CSS and everything in those. The designers that we were talking with and that we were working with didn't really like having to go into a JavaScript file to edit the CSS. And so instead, we decided to create a folder for each element and have an SCSS file and a JavaScript file. And you can see if we look at our ERIS toast JavaScript file here, that we're injecting in our gulp process, we're injecting the CSS before it goes off to get transpiled. So we have our JavaScript file and our SCSS file, and in each of the JavaScript files, we have a class with ERIS toast, or with the name, the camel case name of the element. And then we have the element name that you would use in the HTML here so that we could reuse that is method over and over. We have a make, our template function as well, has a make element function. And you'll see that in this first file that we load in before we load in our elements and to concatenate them into one file, we have a make element function that puts all of this CSS and HTML into the template. The reason we had to do this was because with the polyfills that we're using, if you look down here in our constructor, the shadow root, we're having to use append child, document import node, and then importing the template content. We couldn't use the shadow root.innerHTML and then just set it to what that the template was, I guess, for that. The content of the template was. There's some discussion on the Shady DOM polyfill on how to do that, but there's not been a whole lot of success right now into setting inner HTML. But appending, using append child and import node works just as fine. And so with our ERIS toast, we said we had a function for peak where it goes and it shows for a few seconds, and then it brings the toast back down. We also have the connected callback, and in our connected callback, if the shadow DOM isn't supported natively, we do apply styles for the element, and then down here, before we do define our custom element, we prepare the template as well with the shady CSS polyfill. So that's our Eris toast element. If we look at the Eris select element, you'll see that again we have our is function. So we have, this is what the name of our element, and then we have the template here as well, and we're injecting the CSS before it gets transpiled. And with the select box, we noticed that we had to make it more accessible. So we had to make our element, since it was acting like a select, we had to make it behave like a select would, to have a disabled state and to also have a fire change event. And so there were some extra things that we had to do. We also found this to be the case for any inputs. You want to make sure that accessibility is top of mind when you're creating a web component that's supposed to act like an input, that you do your disabled states, and that you set the value as well of that element whenever the input inside of the shadow DOM is. And so there's something to be said for extending the input and extending the select. And so we're looking forward to doing that in the future. So here you can see we used a getter and setter to handle the disabled states of the select box. Then we use a fire change event. And again, I mentioned this earlier that we were using this because it needed to look at all the Eris selects and take a look at whether or not it was set, that beacon was set to some other property. And if it was, it would take it off of that property. And so to do this, we use mutation observers, but we also had to use mutation observers to have the options in the light DOM. When the selected attribute changed on one of the options in the light DOM, we needed a mutation observer to make sure that that selected attribute also changed on the shadow DOM options as well. And so we used a mutation observer that watched the attributes and then set those accordingly. So there was a lot more work in with the select box, and also, you know, any feedback that you guys have, we greatly appreciate, because we're still learning how to maybe do this better, and we're just really getting our feet wet. Like I said, we've just been a few months in on really using these components. But if we look down in the connected callback, you can see we're also setting the add event listener for changing whenever the select changes. We want to fire off the change event, and then we have an attribute change callback so that if the disabled state changes, it will, or the disabled attribute changes on our Eris select element, it'll also disable the select inside of the shadow DOM. With this project, our build process was pretty simple. First, we want to include the first file, .js, that has our make template function. Then we include our different web components. Then we transpile things, and we put it into one components.js file. And we weren't too happy with that. We didn't use HTML imports because of some discussion we found about performance, and so we decided just to use 3 out of the 4 web component specs for now, and that's how we created this project. Now, out of this project came a necessity. There were a few things that we discovered. One, that there was kind of a template for how the JavaScript file should look like, you know, with the life cycle callbacks and our template function, and then and how everything should be. And also, we got some feedback as well from designers and developers that, hey, you know what, it'd be great if we could separate the HTML from that and inject the CSS and HTML before transpiling. And so we decided that we would create a web component starter kit, if you will. And so I'll pull this down here and we can take a look. So here we have our, let me get rid of these. We have a web component starter kit repo, and this is out on GitHub on our Aristotle-Labs account. And you will be able to use this and even contribute to this. We would love to have people contribute as well. So with this starter kit, we decided to do a couple of things. One is we created a Yeoman Generator. And so if I clear this out, if we go yo wc, it's going to spin up the Yeoman Generator. But you can see in our components file, we still have a folder for each component. And then we have a SCSS, a JavaScript, and an HTML file. When it builds a CSS file as well. And but we have inside of our JavaScript file, we have a template that is created. And then inside of our HTML, remember I said that we had a camel case version of an ID with a camel case version of the element name. And so it goes ahead and it creates that through the Yeoman Generator. And then we have our SCSS file, which just has the host selector in there. And so, but this helped our designers and our developers in kind of splitting out concerns, because the designers were really worried about the CSS and the HTML more than the JavaScript. And so they were able to kind of stay away from the JavaScript there. So when we start the Yeoman Generator, it'll ask for our element name. And so we'll just call this one a remote conf. And then it'll ask for a description. And this is just the WC remote conf test element. And then when we add that in, it's going to create our few different files for us here. And over here, it will update. There we go. So now we have a remote conf folder in our components folder. And inside we have our 3 different files. So if we look at our HTML file, you see it's that element with an ID of remote conf. And what it did was take the HTML element name that you would use, and it actually made a camel case version and set that as the ID. And then our JavaScript file is very similar. It takes the camel case version and uses it as the class name. Then you have the element name here, and then you have the places where your files get injected, and then just the basic template. So we have the constructor, the connected callback. Everything is named appropriately for you to just kind of start creating that web component and the behaviors and adding the CSS. And then, of course, if we look into the SCSS file, we'll see that we have our host selector there. So this kind of helped us to create vanilla web components a little bit easier, and gave us kind of a good head start. But one of the things that we were lacking was, again, that style guide that developers and designers could use to come together and kind of have a common language about what the different elements should look like and how they should behave. And so we created a styleguide.json file. And whenever you created your element in the Yeoman Generator, you'll see that it actually will add that element into an array of elements for you. So looking at this JSON file, we have a page title and page description of the style guide. We have an elements array that has different element objects. Each element object has a name, a description, and an examples array as well. So you can do multiple examples in the style guide. You have a title for each example, a description. The HTML is actually what HTML will be able to be copy and pasted. So it kind of shows the syntax of how to use that example. And then the code here is actually what gets rendered onto the page so that you can show a working example. So you can see that we don't have any examples in our remote conf element just yet. But if we were to use gulp build and go look at our local host 3000, Here we go. So you'll see that it pulls up the kind of a very rough kind of styled style guide for you, pulls in the page title and the style guide description. Then there's a menu over here. You can see we've got our remote conf element, which was just added for us. And then if we were to go to our Eris Toast element, you can see here's that syntax that shows us how to create this example and helps us to prototype things faster. And then we can see a working example. There's our little hello user test there. Then we can go to our beacon select instead of Eris select. We called it beacon select after the project. And you can see the syntax there, and we can see a working example here. So if I were to go into that JSON file and add examples for remote conf, it would render all of that here as well. So let's go back to our slides. Awesome. So out of our kind of experimentation and out of our journey, we had created this starter kit that other people can use, and you can find it, like I said, on GitHub. We'd love to have people contribute to it. We want to add in, we're going to be adding in some things like writing integration tests and unit tests for the web component through the Yeoman Generator as well. And also, one of the things that we, like I said earlier, right now in our build process, everything goes to a components.js file, and we don't really like that because it kind of bloats up things. And so we're experimenting right now as well with using Browserify to only add the components that we would use, and then only adding in the polyfills if a component is on that particular page, and which is kind of the function of what the HTML imports is serving. And so we're trying to test the two performance-wise and see what the difference might be. So definitely go and would love for people to use the starter kit and help us with that repo as well. So the bottom line, we can definitely use web components. Vanilla web components are possible today. There are polyfills that we can use that are available, and you can use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to create components and create modular web apps. It's also easy to get started with the starter kit that we made. It's much faster for us to begin creating components. And then also, it's also easy to maintain with our documentation, with our style guide, and with being able to add examples and different things and to change that content on the style guide. They're very it's easier to maintain so that developers and designers do have that common place that they can go to and kind of have that common language. And the idea here is that we want to use the platform, right? So if we use the basic building blocks of the web, they're going to continue to get better. And so that's kind of the philosophy we're kind of going with in our team is let's use the things that are closest to the specs and the platform. And that way we have less dependencies in terms of libraries or frameworks, and hopefully the application loads faster because of that. And so that's what we have run with. So my name is Matt Shull again, and I'm the director of Aristotle Labs. And you can find me on Twitter and contact me through aristotlelabs.com or mattshull.com. I'd love to talk on Twitter and talk about different ways, different solutions that anyone else has found as well. And that is my talk.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's really great to see some practical examples of people using vanilla web components in production. It's great. Obviously, there's a lot of focus on a lot of the libraries as well. So thank you for that. You've been the cause of some heated debate in the chat, and which is really good. Lots of things about polyfills, etc. And Rob Dodson has posted some good resources in there. If anybody hasn't checked those links out, please go ahead. And I think we've got some time for some questions, if you'd be able to do that for us. Okay, so the first question is, do you find it painful to work without data binding? Does the extra effort make you consider using a data binding library?
Yeah, it does. And so we are considering right now. There's a furious debate. I say furious. We have wonderful discussions in our team, but on whether to use React or to use Vue.js. And so we're just, it's an internal struggle. And our head of development is actually listening right now, and I know he's laughing right now because he's like, "There's no way." So. Yeah, we are feeling that pain, but not as much as we thought we would, if that makes sense. So we do kind of feel like maybe it's not necessarily, something right away that we need to fix. We're not feeling an urgency, but we are like, okay, we know where this will come in handy down the road, and so we need to find that solution. And so, yes.
Cool. Okay, there's another question as well from Rob Stone, which is, it seems that by going native, you added a fair amount of complexity to your code/solution. I guess in the long term, this may have some benefits, but do you still think the cost of using Polymer outweighed the advantages it gives in reducing the amount of code you have to write?
Yeah, so I think definitely that there is a huge advantage for using Polymer. And like I said, we really loved Polymer, but we also wanted to kind of take and try our hand at doing the vanilla. Also, we our labs team, we kind of stay on the edge. We want to stay on the edge and document our process along the way. And so I think that there's that inspiration behind using vanilla web components. It did add some complexity, absolutely, but we're kind of documenting the woes and the celebrations along the way, and we'll be blogging about those things. But I agree with the person that asked the question. I think in the long term, we're going to see a big benefit, especially as browsers are picking up these specs.
Thank you very much. Great answers. So again, thank you very much for coming on and delivering your talk. No problem. And for everybody else watching, we'll be moving on to the next session shortly. Thank you.